Well, thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Anna, for the invitation, and thank you all for attending. I'll speak today about the metaphysics of two late ancient Platonic philosophers. The first is a Greco-Egyptian philosopher, Plotinus, the author of the Aeneid, and the leader of the Platonic school in Rome, where his well-known pupils Porphyry and Aemilius studied. He's best known today as really the founder of a movement called Neoplatonism. The second figure is perhaps less well known. It's Iamblichus. He's a Greco-Syrian philosopher from the 5th century, more or less. Iamblichus is less well known today, but he was really important in his own day for starting a series of a school in Apamea that had a large influence on the Athenian school of Neoplatonism. So my plan today is to introduce Plotinus's metaphysics, Iamblichus's critiques, and specifically insofar as they raise implications for the theme of our conference today, panpsychism. I hope to introduce also some new contributions to understanding of Iamblichus towards the end. So first, because I don't wish to presume that everybody knows the writings of these late ancient Platonists, I'd like to begin with a brief sketch of some of their common and salient metaphysical doctrines, especially those that are at stake in this debate. So first, I think it's fair to say that these Platonists adhere to a metaphysics of what we would call, technically speaking, a hienology. So that's a philosophical system of metaphysics whereby reality is derived from one as the first principle, one beyond being. And this is distinguished from an ontology, which strictly speaking holds that reality is derived from a first principle of being. A second point I wish to raise is that these Platonists are committed to what I would call a principle of prior simplicity, whereby complex phenomena in the world is derived from prior simplicity. These two commitments structure their reality. For example, one can sketch Plotinus's metaphysics according to three levels of reality, or hypostases, as they came to be known. The one, that is the first principle, which properly speaking is beyond being; the intellect, what Plotinus calls the one many, which is the first being; and then soul, what Plotinus calls the one and many. The first major point I want to discuss is how Plotinus's doctrine of soul raises the questions of panpsychism and its potential slippage into monopsychism. Plotinus analyzes the soul as the one and many insofar as he holds that there is indeed one soul, one reality of soul, but there are also many souls, and just as many souls as there are living beings, beginning with the soul of the cosmos and including all living beings in the cosmos. Plotinus asks, are all souls ultimately one, and is your soul identical to my soul? He answers by inquiring into the principle of differentiation between souls and the hypostasis, or the reality of soul as such. And here we'll see what is going through my talk as a whole is discussions of identification and differentiation, or distinct beings and interconnectedness of beings. So, for example, and I've got just quotations with the Greek and the translation on the side that you can follow along. So, for example, in one of Plotinus's tractates, 4.9, which his student Porphyry entitles "If All Souls Are One," Plotinus argues, first, that the soul of each individual is one, and two, that it is present as a whole throughout the body, and then three, that individual souls come from one prior all soul, we could say the hypostasis soul. Plotinus then raises the possibility of monopsychism, and I quote, named that if all souls are one soul, like the soul of each individual, this is going to be his point of inquiry. He initially responds to this possibility that it would be absurd to think that we have identical particular souls, for if that were the case, we would all have identical passions, experiences, perceptions, and consciousness. Instead, Plotinus will argue that every particular soul participates in and derives its nature from a prior simplicity, the same universal soul prior to every particular soul. Therefore, consciousness or perception, according to Plotinus's reasoning, is not identical to our soul per se, even though differences in consciousness or perception may be a result of our different souls. So, Plotinus then asks,
described. Plotinus then asks whether the internal relation among souls can be explained by a physical theory known as homoiomeres. That is, a mereological theory, what we call a horizontal correlation between wholes and parts, that was originally formulated by the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaxagoras, whereby the whole of any and every material substance is composed of a mixture of parts, or Anaxagoras opposites of wet and dry and smaller and larger. That these parts are themselves of identical properties as the whole. So when I speak about this with my students, I give the example sometimes of Lego blocks. So if you were to build a Lego tower of the Eiffel Tower, but each Lego block itself was in the shape of an Eiffel Tower that built a larger Eiffel Tower, as it were. It's almost like a fractal, as it were. I should say this is the interpretation by Anaxagoras as it comes through by Aristotle and the later Platonists, and the debate whether or not this is actually what Anaxagoras had in mind. And since the same principle holds that for the cosmos as a whole, Plotinus concludes, everything will be in everything. And I quote in the quotation, if then the one prior soul was a body, it would be necessary for the many to come into existence by the division of this, each one becoming an entirely different substance. If the one soul is uniform in all its parts, all the souls would be formally the same, bearing one and the same complete form, but would differ in their corporeal masses. And if their soulness was due to their underlying masses, they would be different from each other. But if it was due to the forms, the souls would be formally the same. In other words, Plotinus concludes that the one soul from which all souls derive, their being cannot be material, since matter per se is indefinite bare mass without formal properties. The principle of differentiation of soul, therefore, cannot be a physical mixture of homoiomeres, and must therefore be found in the immaterial and in the incorporeal. And Plotinus is even very strongly adamant that souls do not need to be embodied to be individuals. So matter per se cannot be responsible for the differentiation and individuation of souls. Its differentiation must come from some kind of immaterial and formal relation. And in 4.9, the same Tractatus, Plotinus further argues that the formal relation of individual souls to a universal soul is like a formal relation of a geometric theorem to science as a whole. Ultimately, Plotinus explains that this difference is according to logoi, which he calls, which we may translate into something like a forming principle of soul that communicates itself into matter. But it comes originally from what Plotinus identified as the intellect, finding its way through soul to the lowest level of soul, which he calls nature. He compares this to unfolding powers in a seed. So take as examples the stone stuck under my shoe, my corn plant at home, and Socrates. An Aristotelian would claim that being inheres in the stone, in the corn plant, and in Socrates, that life inheres in the corn plant and in Socrates, but not in the stone, but intellect only adheres in Socrates, and neither in the corn plant nor in the stone under my shoe. According to Aristotle's definition of soul, as the first grade of actualization of a body capable of life, only the corn plant and Socrates have souls. Plotinus, in the tractate on nature contemplation 1.3.8, argues instead that all things, even plants and stones, contemplate in a certain way. That is, they all have in some capacity being, life, and intellect, because that is being communicated to them through these logoi that are coming from the intellect. So the conclusion, I suppose, then, is that the logoi are responsible both for the differentiation and the interconnectedness of beings in the world. Each soul is potentially interconnected to all logoi, Plotinus says, but is only actually defined by a particular set of them. Plotinus seems to hold that this is a formal correlation akin to how a theorem of a science is potentially connected to all theorems of a science, even though it might only actually express one set of axioms or propositions. His argument, therefore, comes close to transposing the theory of Anaxagoras of everything in everything from the level of the physical cosmos, but he puts it up into the level of the intelligible world. It is still a theory of, I would say, horizontal correlation of parts and wholes, but according to Plotinus, it's applicable at a higher immaterial substance. And if we turn to another tractate where Plotinus explains this intelligible substance on the intelligible beauty. Plotinus echoes the language of Anaxagoras here. He says, for all things there in the intellect are transparent, and there is nothing dark or opaque. Everything and all things are clear to the inmost part to everything. For light...
Excuse me, there seems to be another slide.
Moved on. Oh, thank you. My apologies. So everything is clear in the inmost part to everything. For light is transparent to light. Each there has everything in itself and sees all things in every soul, or in every other. All are everywhere, and each and every one is all, and the glory is unbounded. For each of them is great, because even the small is great, these opposites together. The sun is there in all the stars, and each star is the sun and all the others. A different kind of being stands out in each, but in each all are manifest. So according to my sketch of Plotinus's metaphysics, he concludes that one, our true being is first and foremost individualized at the level of the intelligible intellect, and two, that our true being is differentiated noetically, he would say, differentiated, but not ontologically separated at the level of intellect. That happens at the level of soul, whereby particular souls are differentiated and separated while being interconnected by means of local life. This brings me to the second large point that I wish to discuss about this physical sketch. That's the principle of the intelligibility of being. Plotinus was very well aware that he was revisiting another pre-Socratic, Parmenides' insight that thinking and being are identical. He explains this principle of self-identity of intelligibility and being in another of his works, 5.1, on the three primary hypostases. He calls this the simultaneous coexistence, or one might say the horizontal correlation of intellect and being in each and every single intelligible in the intellect, which again is another way to revisit the Anaxagorean principle of everything and everything at the level of intellect. I quote, for around soul, things come one after another. Now Socrates, now a horse, always some one particular reality, but intellect is all things. But each of them is intellect and being, and the whole is universal intellect and being. Intellect making being exist in thinking it, and being giving intellect thinking and existence by being thought. But the cause of thinking is something else, which is also the cause of being. They both therefore have cause other than themselves, for they are simultaneous and existing together, and one does not abandon the other. But this one is two things, intellect and being, and thinking and thought. Intellect is thinking and being is thought. So more recent proponents and critics of Platonism alike have formulated a version of the proposition that to be is intelligible as the foundation of Platonism itself. Now take Etienne Gilson's version, for example. I quote, if being and intelligibility can be strictly equated, the reason for it is precisely that being has first been equated with self-identity. Now, self-identity is the proper object of conceptual knowledge. To know that there is gold in a certain place is to know that what is to be found there is gold. If what is there is not gold, then there is no gold in that place. To equate reality and identity is merely to make reality be what it ought to be in order to be exhaustively intelligible to human understanding. Now, I quote Gilson's formulation because it explains, I think, the principle well, even though I think it's limited and ultimately wrong in his Thomistic critique of it. He misses the mark, but that's irrelevant to my purposes. I think it's important for two reasons. One, it highlights the principle of self-identity, that it is for something to be, is for it to be what it is. This we find Plato expressing, for example, in the Phaedo. But second, Gilson holds that this principle of self-identity is also not just the nature of reality, but the principle of knowledge. That is, for something to be known is for it to be known as what it is. But the example that he puts forward, knowing that what I find in a particular place is gold, involves limited conditions and an empirical judgment of a particular sensible being, a piece of gold. But given that the Platonists hold that immaterial beings exist, one must also inquire whether the conditions of the Platonic principle change if what is cognized is not a particular sensible substance, but an immaterial one, let's say the divine intellect or God. So I'll put forward two assumptions of Platonism and then one question. Our first assumption: if thinking is identical to being, Platonists hold that the relationship of self-identity between thinking and being is convertible. Namely, one could express the principle thinking is identical to being as being is identical to thinking. And it is for this reason that Platonists following Plotinus argue that the first being occurs at the level of the first intellect. A second assumption: if thinking is identical to being, Platonists hold that it is reasonable to assume that my thinking is identical to my being. Now the question: is the relationship between a particular instance of thinking and a particular being convertible? Although I'm certain some might find it objectionable, many Platonists would not be troubled to state that if my thinking is identical to my being, so too my being is identical to my thinking. We can imagine someone interjecting that this might hold for the particular being in question of a human being, but not, for example, with other beings like a corn plant. Most would be confident in saying that the corn plant does not think, and its lack of thinking, therefore, is not identical with its being. Plotinus, as I suggested, may think otherwise. But for the moment, let's just continue with human beings. One could conceive of the relationship between the two propositions, my thinking is identical to my being, and my being is identical to my thinking, as expressing conditions for me to be and for me to think. But this condition is once more about thinking full stop. Do the conditions change if I qualify my thinking as thinking a particular thought, gold or God, for example? One can suppose that it is hypothetically possible for someone to have never have thought of gold. And so it would seem absurd to conclude that our being is identical to thinking about gold. However, for some Platonists like Plotinus, the conditions are different than thinking about gold or God, insofar as our true being is identical to thinking about the divine intellect. But one might object, our being cannot be cognizing the divine intellect because this would mean that we always cognize the divine intellect, or because, again, it's hypothetically possible that someone never heard of a notion of God or the divine intellect, a newborn baby, for example, or an isolated hypothetical person who grew up isolated on an island. But against these objections, Plotinus will differentiate thinking about the divine intellect and being aware or conscious that one is thinking about the divine intellect. So that even if we're not conscious of our thinking, we're always thinking about the divine intellect in an analogous way to how my lungs will breathe, continually expand and retract, even though I'm not conscious of the fact that I'm breathing. For Plotinus, this is possible because soul has an amphibious nature. And as I've already begun to explain, Plotinus holds that the soul turns up towards the intelligible, as well as turns down into sensible being. So it has the admirable function of helping create plurality into the world. This isn't the case for just what he calls the all-soul, but for our particular souls as well. And this brings me to the point of contention between Iamblichus and Plotinus. As Plotinus phrases it, he holds a thesis of an undescended, we might call also an undescended intellect, the highest part of the soul, as he said. I quote, "And if against the belief of others, one is to venture to express more clearly one's own view, the fact is that even our own soul does not descend in its entirety, but there is something of it always in the intelligible world. However, if that part, which is in the sensible world, becomes dominant, or rather, if it is to be dominated and subjected to disturbance, it does not permit there to be self-awareness or consciousness in us of that of which the upper part of the soul is in contemplation. For that which is the object of intellection by the upper part only impinges on us when, in its descent, it reaches our self-awareness." What Plotinus designates as an undescended higher part of the soul, mind or intellect.
Algum dia que dava jeito para passar pela obra, embora. Eu perguntei. Depois, Não
He
sei se
claims that
recordo
this is
bem,
itself.
foi combinado uma
The
reunião
keen students of Platonism will now realize that the doctrine of the
Yeah.
undescended soul or the undescended intellect is
Eles
precisely the
não
thesis that
ficou nada
Iamblichus
combinado.
criticized.
Estamos a aguardar a vossa decisão em relação ao
Plotinus' doctrine of the undescended intellect has been
consigo
characterized
alinhar o
as
quadro.
a heresy in the long history of Platonism
Agora, o
and
que é
was
que você
accepted only by
recorda?
his immediate disciples.
O que é que você
As
recorda?
Blumenthal and Clark argue, Iamblichus is the first defeat, is what they call a radical deviation in Platonism. I quote, that Iamblichus may have been responsible for the restoration of the orthodoxy that the whole soul was part of the individual in the physical world. Now, there's a small dossier of texts that supply evidence for Iamblichus' disagreement with Plotinus, and I'll examine a few. I'll take a first quick look at what I'm calling Exhibit B. It should start with Exhibit A, but here we are, Exhibit B. He writes, let us now ascend to the consideration of that substance, which is of itself incorporeal, distinguishing in order all the opinions about the soul in relation to it also. There are some who maintain that such a substance, the translation here says homogeneous, but I might say homoiomere, as the Greek says, and one and the same, such that all of it may be found in any part of it. And they place even in the individual soul, the intelligible world, and the gods and demons and the good, and all the beings superior to it, and declare everything to be in everything in the same way, but in a manner appropriate to its essence. It says we find this in Menis, Plotinus, and Porphyry in different degrees. And according to this doctrine, the soul differs in no way from intellect and from the gods and from all the whole superior class of beings. So in their commentary on this passage, John Finnemore and John Dillon find difficulty locating what they describe as the Numenian formula in Plotinus, but they put forward a helpful comparison with the passage from the Aeneid, where Plotinus declares that a part of us remains in the intelligible, while I quote, we are each one of us an intelligible universe. However, I believe that we can be even more precise regarding Iamblichus' criticism of the formula, everything to be in everything in the same way, but in an appropriate manner to its essence, insofar as Iamblichus is directing his criticism at what I've characterized as Plotinus' transposition of the Anaxagoras theory of homoiomere to the intelligible realm. As Iamblichus phrases it, there are some who maintain that such a substance is a homoiomere and one and the same, such that all of it may be found in any part of it, and they place even the individual soul in the intelligible world. This theory, as Iamblichus correctly recognizes, is the metaphysical ground on which all philosophers uphold the doctrine of everything and everything. It is for this reason that Iamblichus then contrasts this theory to his own. Plotinus introduces this theory in part to defend against panpsychism that slips into monopsychism, but Iamblichus is adamant that this is a weak safeguard. And I'm not going to read the passage, but he says the doctrine opposed to this, Iamblichus' own, separates soul off from the intellect. Then he defines soul as an intermediary between a middle term and a higher metaphysical hierarchy. So a second piece of evidence, which I'm going to call Exhibit A, in the case of Iamblichus versus Plotinus, comes from this latest commentary of Proclus' commentary on Timaeus, where they're commenting on the descent of soul in the bodies in Plato's Timaeus. I'm not going to read the quotation. I'm just going to bring up some conclusions that we have from the quotation. According to this passage, we know that Plotinus and some of his disciples, I quote, want to preserve in us an element that is impassible and always enjoying intellection. And two, that the divine Iamblichus is quite correct, I quote, in attacking those who hold this position. And three, as examples for why the soul is completely descended into the body, they're proposing an exegetical debate over how to understand it in Plato. They say, in Plato, the soul is completely descended, ergo, Plotinus is wrong. That's the argument that's being made. So there's been quite a bit of attention to this, beginning with Erododes in the 1930s. But the first and long systematic study of it is a piece of scholarship, a quite brilliant and groundbreaking book by Carlos Steele from 1978 called The Changing Self, Study of the Soul in Later Neoplatonism. Steele, like everyone else who studied the case of Iamblichus versus Plotinus, makes his argument on what I'm calling Exhibit A here. Now, there is, however, another piece of irreconcilable evidence found from another late ancient commentary, Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's categories, that seems to directly contradict the dominant interpretation of Iamblichus's critique of Plotinus. And this comes from a passage in Aristotle's categories where Aristotle is discussing correlative terms of necessity, the tapros ti. That is, terms that are thought to come into existence simultaneously, since the existence of one term necessitates the other, like half necessitates the double. That's Aristotle's example. Aristotle remarked in the categories that not all correlative terms necessarily come into existence simultaneously. And I quote Aristotle here, the object of knowledge would appear to exist before knowledge itself, where it is not usually the case that we acquire knowledge of the objects already existing. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to find a branch of knowledge, the beginning of the existence of which was contemporaneous with its object. To which Simplicius writes, and I'm quoting the bottom here, the intelligibles without matter exist simultaneously with the knowledge. The intelligibles without matter exist simultaneously with the knowledge that is always active. So either there is such a knowledge in us that is always remaining up there, as Plotinus and Iamblichus believe, post Platino kai Iamblico dokai, or such knowledge exists in the active intellect only, if one wishes to call the activity of the active intellect science. So the simultaneous coexistence of knowledge and its object as relative terms could only be possible in two cases: if our intellect is undescended and remains always active with the divine intellect, according to Simplicius, or if our intellect descends, only the divine intellect. But Simplicius attributes the first position to Plotinus and Iamblichus, which flies in the face of the majority interpretation of Iamblichus's critique of Plotinus. Steele took note of this and proposed an ingenious solution to solve the contradiction by suggesting that we ought to amend the Greek text, so that instead of reading hos Platino kai Iamblico dokai, one should read hos Platino kata Iamblikon dokai. So Simplicius would therefore be just saying that as Iamblichus reports as the doctrine of Plotinus, as opposed to as Iamblichus and Plotinus think. But however ingenious this emendation might be, it's not philologically plausible, as Steele himself seems to acknowledge. And moreover, the problem remains that there's other evidence ignored by Steele in his book that also seems to challenge, if not outright contradict, this majority interpretation of Iamblichus's critique of Plotinus. This has been brought forward first in 1997 by Vandenberg from a series of notes from Damascus's commentary on Plato's Phaedo. And I won't read them in detail, but suffice to say that the evidence seems to show that, according to Vandenberg, reading information from Damascus, Iamblichus seems to think that there are some souls who remain undescended. It's not everybody's souls, the special souls of holy men, people like Pythagoras and Plato, as it were. So I'd like to bring some new evidence to the question that seems to have been neglected by everyone, as far as I can tell. And it comes from a passage from the Denis, one of Iamblichus's most famous works. It occurs at the very beginning of the work, when Iamblichus responds to Plotinus and his student Porphyry, who had acknowledged to Iamblichus, I concede to you that gods exist, that the divine exists. Iamblichus then responds, and I'm going to read a little bit of this because it's important for my conclusion. Well then, you Porphyry, first acknowledge to concede that the gods exist, but speaking like this is incorrect. For a natural cognition of the gods coexists with their very being, and is superior to every judgment and intentional choice, and exists prior to reason and demonstration, and is united from its principle to its own cause and is interwoven with the soul's substantial desire for the good. But if I were to speak truly, it is not a cognition of divinity, but a contact with divinity. For cognition is separated in a certain way through alterity, but prior to this cognition of another as another, there is a naturally automatic and indestructible interweaving of its simple form connecting it to the gods. One must not, therefore, assent to this cognition of the divinity as though it were possible to concede or not concede, nor is it to be posited as uncertain, for it remains always in activity according to its unified form. Nor is it worthy to examine it as though we were its Lord in judgment defending it. Rather, we are enveloped in it, filled by it, and we have our self-identity, which is our true being, in cognizing the gods. But you seem to believe that the cognition of the gods is identical to the cognition of other things, gold, for example, and to concede one part of antithetical positions, as is customarily proposed for them in dialectical exercises. But this is in no way at all comparable, for the knowledge of the gods is completely different, separated from all logical antithesis, and does not consist in assenting now that the gods exist. Rather, the cognition of the gods always exists, and its simple form coexists from eternity in the soul. So I'll make several points about what Iamblichus is saying here in order to arrive at my conclusion. In order to solve the contradiction of the passage that I described as Exhibit C, Steele originally proposed the conjectural correction of the Greek text of Iamblichus, while Blumenthal and Arist proposed the developmental account of Iamblichus's philosophy of mind, arguing that Iamblichus might have first accepted Plotinus' undescended intellect before ultimately rejecting it. Neither option is necessary when one glosses Simplicius' testimony about Iamblichus in what I called Exhibit C, with Iamblichus' own arguments from the Denis, what I'm calling Exhibit D. For Simplicius proposes that Iamblichus, like Plotinus, holds that there exists a certain kind of knowledge that is correlative to its object, that is a certain kind of knowledge that necessarily exists immediately and contemporaneously with what it knows. The only kind of knowledge that would meet this criterion would be one that coexists eternally with the knower and the known. This is precisely what Iamblichus proposes to Porphyry in Denis 1.3, arguing that the cognition, or rather what I might call a hypercognition of the gods, exists and is coexistent with the existence of the gods. In both passages, in Simplicius's account of Iamblichus and in Iamblichus's comments to Porphyry, the operative term is coexistence. The Greek is synupaxis. But what exactly does Iamblichus mean by coexistent or synupaxis? A first observation is that Iamblichus is differentiating the connotations of coexistence, synupaxis, from the connotations of substance or essence, ousia. Porphyry, his intellectual opponent here, surely understood this because he too employs the cognate hupaxis in a different capacity as ousia, whereas the latter signifies the essence or substance of a being, according to Porphyry. The former denotes the activity of pure being. The pair of terms signify something like a difference between essence and existence. Iamblichus employs synupaxis, not hupaxis, but synupaxis, in a related but somewhat different manner. He too differentiates and relates it to substance or essence, ousia, in order to express what I take to be a metaphysical, technically speaking, a henological presence of a substance. That is, the synupaxis denotes how the substance is. How the substance is fundamentally a unity, which we might call a state, and how it is in terms connected and unified with the one, which we might call this activity of coexistence. It is for this reason that synupaxis is a correlative term, a coexistence, or one might say a co-presence. Therefore, Iamblichus's arguments in 1.3, in Denis 1.3, fundamentally revises what it described as the principle that to be is to be intelligible by postulating a pre-ontological way of cognition, or we might say hypercognition. To be is to be one. It is for this reason that Iamblichus claims that, properly speaking, it's not a cognition of divinity so much as a contact. Iamblichus is consistently employing precise metaphysical terminology for the forms here. They're monoides and henoides. This kind of hypercognition, or simply Iamblichian cognition, as I might call it, is not a knowledge of different properties of beings. It's rather a connection of a simple and unified form. It's not thinking about separate parts of substances, it's about its unified whole. So it's not an Anaxagorean theory of homeromeres either. It's a kind of, I might say, monadology, whereas our simple and unified form of our soul, he claims, our true substance or essence, which is fully descended, is connected to the simple and unified forms of the divine. Technically speaking, it's not our nous or intellect that is engaging in the activity here, but what Iamblichus calls the one of the soul. In other words, it's not like our discursive thinking that takes place at certain times, or that is dependent on our consciousness or awareness. It's always active and always co-present with what is up there. And if our mind is often characterized by Platonists as our highest part of the soul, Iamblichus' one of the soul is even higher, according to him. Can one call it undescended, like Iamblichus does? I don't think Iamblichus wants to launch the one of the soul onto the same horizontal and ontological plane of the divine intellect as Plotinus seems to do, but rather he wants to link up all of these unities in a series of vertical chains. And the term synuparxis and its cognates occur with relative frequency in the writings of Iamblichus. But since I've not been able to find a study of this yet, I decided to undertake even a lexical study of how this occurs in Iamblichus' fragments. And if one begins to look for this term in philosophers before him, we find that it's a very rare occurrence. We find a few occurrences in Plotinus. There are only 2 mentions in the Lexicon Platonianum, even though that's a somewhat limited corpus, but still. But when we do find Plotinus speaking about it, he uses it to express the internal relation of self-identity, most famously in the passage that I read to you already from Aeneid 5.1 on the 3 primary hypostases to explain the coexistence of being and thought in the intellect. He uses it here. So Plotinus speaks about the coexistence of the synuparxis, not just of being an intellect as such, but of the divine intellect with our own undescended intellect. And it expresses something like a horizontal relationship of whole and part as expressed in the principle of everything is in everything that Iamblichus critiques. Iamblichus, to conclude, thus seems to turn this horizontal correlation of coexistence that he finds in the divine intellect onto its side to formulate it as a vertical relationship of coexistence between higher and lower substances. And it might be interesting for if there's any metaphysicians in the room to find out that he speaks about 2 kinds of coexistence, one which he calls according to substance, the kathypostasin, and one according to, you could say, logical form, which he calls kataskesin. The former, he gives the example of how light is coexistent with the sun, and therefore if you take one, you take the other one disappears simultaneously with being dependent on it. And the other one, the one of just formal relation, he gives the example of how a son is coexistent with a father, but if a son or a father dies, the being of the other being does not disappear, even though the definition of son or father might disappear. Modern metaphysicians might call this a Cambridge change, where you get something to your right and that thing moves. You're no longer to the left of that thing, but there is no substantial change to you, as it were. The end result for Iamblichus is a more rigid stratification of metaphysics, in which each essence keeps its place in the hierarchy, all the while permitting differentiation and interconnectedness. Iamblichus believes that he's putting up a stronger defense than Plotinus against panpsychism that slips into a monopsychism. He contends, 1, that without a principle of unification, all of reality would be nothing more than a mereological gathering of parts, next to parts, next to parts, next to parts, without ever becoming a whole. But 2, if that this principle of unification is the self-identity of the undescended soul with the intellect, as Plotinus holds, we would have something of an everything in everything, which according to Iamblichus is something of a panpsychism that slips into a monopsychism of undifferentiated whole. By positing a principle of coexistence, Iamblichus believes that he is dodging both of these problems.
But extremely rich and illuminating paper comparing Plotinus with Iamblichus. Just a couple of thoughts while people are gathering their questions. So Plotinus uses this language of synapsis and this images for a sort of hypercognition. Do you think there's actually a sort of Platonian influence in this? I mean, ironically, in this attack on a Platonian position that he's in a way radicalizing an element. And secondly, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on your thought about the collapse into monopsychism. There's the famous Philip Merlan book on that topic. So the first question is a sort of rather more technical point vis-a-vis Plotinus and Iamblichus. The second is the broader context of this conference today, and the question of panpsychism, monopsychism, and the relevance of this debate.
Yeah, there's regarding your first question, there's a way I could characterize this maybe unfairly as what the colloquial American expression might be of inside baseball, meaning a debate amongst people who already share a whole set of assumptions that are more important than their differences, that the minutiae are greatly expanded in the debate. But I do think Iamblichus, he would want to, I think, stress the difference between the two. And I think you're absolutely right. So about there being already this tendency in Plotinus, and maybe Iamblichus is amplifying them. And more importantly, I think he's trying to be terminologically precise. Or he's trying to develop akin to an Aristotelian approach of being terminologically consistent. So if we look at in Plotinus will use the language of contact to speak about a hypernoesis and the language of sunaphe, but he doesn't use it as extensively as Iamblichus does. The language of having some kind of contact that is prior to discursive reasoning, prior to conscious awareness of thinking, is absolutely present in Plotinus. And Plotinus famously uses poetic imagery to talk about it. Iamblichus is trying to find a way to be metaphysically terminological to explain what's going on. Another point that I would say too is 2 points. One is Plotinus will say that the one, as it were, is also a principle of unification and differentiation. And he'll say that all beings are unified realities that are discrete beings while also interconnected. And he says that fundamentally it's because we partake might be the wrong word, but have a share of, or have been given a unified being from the one, or dependent on might be a better way to phrase it. Again, we see a kind of amplification in Iamblichus in the beginning of a doctrine where he wants to be terminologically precise and be consistent. Says, well, what that is something we call the one of the soul. And we don't really have the same kind of doctrine of the one of the soul in Plotinus. We see it in Iamblichus, and then it becomes very important in later ancient Platonists, the Athenian school in particular. So there too, we see a kind of Plotinus being something of a seedbed, and then differentiating positions come out. I think where the one of the soul becomes important for Iamblichus in particular, and this leads to the second broader question about monopsychism, is for Iamblichus, it's a better safeguard against a worry that there is no individual soul. I think Plotinus too wants to have individualized souls that are united and connected. I think Iamblichus's disagreement is that he thinks that it's that Plotinus does not have a strong argument. And so the language of these ones of the soul being what both contains individual substances as discrete individual substances, while also maintaining a connection amongst each other, is going to be his solution to that problem. And there
So it's
too,
the principle of identity, but also
yeah.
as well the communality.
That's right, it's a principle of identity and a principle of differentiation, but it is also the principle of interconnectedness. Now, the key for Iamblichus is it is not ontological. It is technically, this is where it becomes very technical, it's phenomenological. It's prior to the definition of substance. Whereas one finds an equivalent in Plotinus, but it is at least expressed in this passage as being ontological. And that's Iamblichus's fear. It's the horizontal correlation for Plotinus of being an intellect with all intellects. Iamblichus seems to think that that would make us all essentially be coterminous in the same ontological plane. So as I tried to explain, Iamblichus flips the relation and turns it into a vertical relation in order to have a hierarchical differentiation. And the end result is a structure of reality that is hierarchically organized, like Plotinus, but more rigidly so, into Byzantine stratification of layers of reality.
Thank you. That is.
Well, that was very, very interesting. So one point I want to make about the one of the soul. So I think it's true that in Plotinus there is no formulated conception of it, of course, but I think he has this underlying idea. For instance, as you said, in 6:9, Plotinus says that what differentiates one being from another is the one of this being, which seems counterintuitive. So it's not the form, the essence, but it's what is common to all differentiates between all things. So I would identify it ultimately with existence, following Gerson and Corrigan. So the oneness is existence, although of course it's not a atomistic formulation yet. But for what is fascinating in Plotinus is that he constantly wants to maintain this balance between identity and difference, which is of course based on Plato's The Sophist and the idea that tauton and heteron, they have to coexist in being. So Plotinus, it's a pure balance. So this is very interesting how Iamblichus is not able to maintain this balance. So he's afraid of monism and pantheism, which is of course, if you put too much stress on identity, you forget about differentiation, you get all the pantheistic and monistic kind of Spinozist philosophies. On the other hand, if you forget about identity, you get just this proliferation of parts and fragments. Ultimately, you get in a dark hole of Democritus or Iamblichus or our modern worldview. So the genius of Plotinus is this simple but paradoxical thought that everything is one and also everything is differentiated. So every one of us has an individual soul, but we are also united in sort of one soul, however we understand this. But this is fascinating how already very quickly people were not able to maintain this paradoxical view of reality, but sort of felt that we have to incline more to one or more to another side.
Yeah, thank you. Those are brilliant comments. And as I hope to, with the 2 points I raised in the conclusion, I hope to make clear is exactly this, that both Iamblichus and Plotinus would agree that you need a principle of unification in reality. Otherwise, you just have parts next to parts next to parts next to parts and never a whole. And even the parts themselves are not unified as parts. It's a regress problem. It can go on into infinity of infinite divisibility of parts into further parts. So they both agree you need a principle of unification. Both ultimately posit one. Iamblichus, I think the main disagreement is that he believes that Plotinus's argument isn't a strong one, and that there still is, you could say, a fear of slippage into either the under differentiate of this parts next to parts, or an undifferentiated unified monism, as it were. Specifically for Iamblichus's concern is for souls as well too, that we would lose a sense of individualized, differentiated reality. So he proposes what I take to be this, presented it almost as a kind of existentialist account, but one of coexistence, that there is, he takes it to be a more robust defense. Whether he succeeds, I leave it up to you, but I think, as you point out, in the immediate generation after Plotinus, this becomes a point of debate and an attempt to arrive at a metaphysical defense of it.
If I may brief follow-up, do you think that this idea of self-transparency of true being can really be a ground for panpsychism? Because of course for Plotinus, every true being is conscious of itself, noetically, I mean, but for Plotinus, sensible substances are not beings. I mean, they are like a portrait of a Socrates to Socrates, they are to true beings. So a plant cannot be conscious of itself as this particular sensible plant. The form of the plant, the god of the plant, the angel of the plant can be self-transparent, but is it really what we could term panpsychism?
Right, I think Anna is going to be addressing this in her talk as well too, the layers of consciousness that one arrives at. And just as a quick point.
Yes, in fact, that I'll challenge what you said, because I think that for true being, for Plotinus, is not self-conscious. We are truly ourselves, but we are not conscious of ourselves.
Depends how we define consciousness, of course.
Yeah, but when we lose the self-awareness and we lose identity of ourselves, like when we reach the union of the one, or when we are in intellect and we are disembodied selves. For Plotinus, this is the truest being. This is our ideal and the real being that we are.
May I suggest, just in terms of timekeeping, that we use this, actually, precisely this point, as a point at which we then thank Denis for a very stimulating and rich paper, but then move on to Anna, so that we can then pursue this.